So we've discussed the engineering behind White Star Line's RMS Oceanic of 1899, but today we're going to take a look at what it would have been like to sail on her as a passenger, how her interior spaces were laid out, and so on and so forth. So the trend is continuing. When I do these videos where I talk about the interior of these ocean liners, I always run into trouble surrounding the deck plans. On the Teutonic class, I couldn't find deck plans for the uppermost deck. On the Kaiser Wilhelm der Große, all the plans were in German. And on this ship, I simply can't find any. As far as I can tell, the deck plans for this ship are either lost to time or in someone's private collection, so I had to make some assumptions about the way this is laid out and go on mostly text descriptions, so some of this might, once again, be a little bit inaccurate, but I'm gonna try my best. So let's just jump right in here. Oceanic is laid out a lot like other White Star liners of the day, and this will seem fairly familiar to anyone who saw my Teutonic class video breaking down the way those ships are laid out. They are set up like most liners, with the first class being in the center of the ship, the second class being positioned around a secondary piece of superstructure, and third class being at the bow and the stern. All of this is spread across 4 decks: main deck, saloon deck, upper deck, and promenade deck, with boat deck on top of all of that. So let's just start at the forward section of main deck, which would be the second row of portholes down from the top of the hull. The first few compartments on this deck would have been dominated by berths for the steerage class passengers, the third class. These berths were more roomy than on other ships, partially due to the ship's size and also because they were packed a little bit less tightly. This allowed for large tables to really dominate the center of the room. These tables would be where steerage class passengers would be served their meals and where they would spend a lot of their free time during the day. These berths at the front of the ship, by the way, would have been almost exclusively for male passengers. This is something that's been present on nearly every White Star liner up until this point. This is due to the way the engine rooms are configured and the fact that most, if not all, of the engine room staff would have been men, so it makes sense to berth the engine room staff at the bow of the ship, so they just berth steerage class men in that same area. After those steerage class areas, you would enter some of the first class areas. The bottom of the first class stairwell, as well as a number of first class cabins. These would have been 2 to 3 bunk cabins that would have allowed for small parties of first class passengers traveling together to share a cabin. After those first class areas would have been more engineering spaces, likely some of the upper elements of the engine rooms and the boiler uptakes, as well as access to some of the coal bunkers for loading and unloading coal. And at the very aft of the ship on main deck here would be a few more compartments for third class passengers. Now, interestingly, this would have included a few cabins. Now, while a majority of the berths at both the front and the back of the ship would have been dormitory-style berthing, so you have a large room with a bunch of bunk beds in it, there were a few cabins located sort of closer to the middle of the ship for third-class passengers. These would have been reserved for families traveling with children to give them their own private space away from the rest of the third-class passengers. Moving up to saloon deck, which is the deck right below the top of the hull, the second row of portholes above the waterline. At the front of the ship, you have much of the same third-class accommodations in large dormitory-style spaces that are open with tables in the middle to allow for meals to be served in those spaces. Aft of that, you come to the first-class sections of the ship. There you have first-class cabins and the first-class staircase, which once again would be very similar to the deck below, but there's one major exception. On this deck is the first-class dining saloon. This is the centerpiece of the ship, this large opulent space with a massive dome over the center of it to allow for the space to feel more airy and to be sort of a decorative crowning centerpiece for the entire ship, especially for the first-class passengers. After that would have likely been the galley. The way many of these ships are laid out, the galley would be placed between the first-class dining saloon and the second-class dining saloon to allow for food to be cooked and then brought right out to the passengers. By the way, it shouldn't need to be said, but the dining saloon is where the passengers in the first class would have gone to eat all of their meals. Immediately behind the galley would be the second-class dining saloon, which is a smaller and slightly less elegant version of the first-class dining saloon. Aft of that would be some second-class cabins and the second-class stairwell used by second-class passengers to traverse up and down on the ship. And at the very stern of the vessel, you would find more accommodations for third-class passengers. These would be large dormitory-style accommodations like what we see at the front of the vessel. Moving up to upper deck, this is the first deck with this open promenade here. Starting at the bow of the ship, you have the forecastle, which would be primarily dominated by crew bunking and some of the equipment needed to operate the steam machinery for docking the vessel. After that, you come to the forward well deck, which is the home of the forward cargo hatches, which are used to load and unload a majority of the ship's cargo, which would go to cargo holds located below the passenger accommodations at the bow of the ship. Moving after that and into the superstructure, we come to the beginning of the first-class sections on this deck. There you're going to have more first-class cabins, which would have been very similar to the cabins on the decks below. Small 1, 2, or 3 berth cabins for first-class passengers traveling as a group. Off of that main stairwell would be the first-class inquiry office, which would serve as sort of a guest services desk as well as a purser's office for the first-class passengers. After that, you come to some more crew berths. This is where you find berths for the pursers and a lot of the stewards and stewardesses that would be tending to the first and second class passengers. And after that, you'd find the first class smoke room right at the back of the superstructure here, where the first class passengers would go after dinner, namely the male passengers, although this segregation was not actually enforced. It was just sort of a social pressure kind of thing. Women just didn't go there. This brings us to this second class space here at the back of the ship, this secondary piece of superstructure, which is entirely dominated by second-class public spaces. This would have included a library and a smoking room for second-class passengers to relax when they're not in the dining room or when they're just trying to enjoy their crossing when they're not eating or sleeping. After that, we get to the very stern of the ship. There you would have seen some accommodations for third-class passengers. Their general room and their smoking room were actually located right back here, and just behind that would be the ship's steering gear. Moving up onto Promenade deck, which is the highest-most deck on the vessel that is not boat deck. So the second row of open promenade decking here. There are more first-class cabins on this deck, and on top of that there is, right here in between the two funnels, the top of the first-class stairwell, which would have been sort of reminiscent of the later Olympic class, but slightly boxier and a lot smaller. On top of the cabins, the other thing on this deck would have been the first-class library, which is where many of the women would go after dinner, as it was a space for reading and writing, which were considered to be relatively feminine pastimes. Still, once again, these gender segregation elements were not strictly enforced. They were simply social etiquette that was followed by most of the passengers. Aft of that, you get to the second-class segment of superstructure, which, like I said, would have included the second-class smoke room and the second-class library. And then you come back to the poop deck, which is the sternmost space on the ship. Above that would be boat deck, which, as the name suggests, houses the ship's complement of lifeboats. These are scattered all across the deck, as you can see here. And this would have been primarily used by crew members, but passengers could go up there to stroll the open segments of deck, most notably first-class passengers, as this is on top of the first-class segment of the ship. This deck would have also included the officers' quarters, where you would have cabins for the captain, the first officer, and his navigation crew, as well as a few other key individuals working with the ship's complement of crew members. You would also have the ship's wireless room up in this area for the operation of the ship's wireless telegraph once it was installed. And lastly, the highest accessible part on the ship, with the exception of the crow's nest, would be the ship's bridge, which is used for navigating the ship. It's from here that the captain and the navigational officers would steer and command the vessel. So that rounds out the layout of the RMS Oceanic. If you'd like to learn more about this ship, I'll leave a link up here to a playlist I'm building all about the Oceanic, that you can learn about her engineering, her design philosophy, some of why she came into being, and you can learn about her career and the events that transpired during this ship's service. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Barbettes and Binnacles, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.